Okay, welcome everyone to Fruits of the Orchard. Tonight we begin a new book, the book of Vayikra, Leviticus. So the whole book is named after the first word, Vayikra, which means, and he called. The he here is God. He called to Moshe. So what's the significance of naming the whole book after and he called? So we're going to go to the end of the previous parsha, the end of the book of Shemot. And I just want to read the context of how and when and where God is calling to Moshe. So the very end of Shemot says, V'lo yechol Moshe lavo el ohel moed, ki shachan alav ha'anan, u'kavod Hashem malei et mishkan. That the context is they have just put up the Mishkan after tremendous effort in building it, and then they put it up and took it down for 7 days. And now it's Rosh Chodesh Nisan, which for us will be this coming Thursday, Rosh Chodesh Nisan. And they put it up. And that's where I just read this verse, that after all that work, what happened is the Shekhinah, God's presence, came and filled the Mishkan. And it says, and Moshe was not able to come into the Mishkan because the cloud, this cloud of glory filled the Mishkan, and there was no place for Moshe. And then it says, okay, so that's what we want to read. So here's the context. So when it says Vayikra, and he called to Moshe, Moshe is standing on the outside. He feels he can't go in because the glory of God is filling the whole Mishkan. It's as if there's no space for him. And God calls to Moshe and, in a sense, invites him in. In other words, there is a place for you. There will always be a place for you. And in Kabbalah and Chassidut, it's explained that really, even though it says specifically that God was only calling Moshe, and Rashi actually makes a big deal out of this, that even though it was in a sense a booming voice, only Moshe heard it. Nonetheless, Kabbalah and Chassidut explains that the invitation to enter into the Mishkan and to enter into the avoda, the service of God, is open to all of us. As the Alter Rebbe said, we all have a spark of Moshe within us. And so therefore, God is calling all of us to enter into the Mishkan, into the service of God, but more than that, into a relationship with God. That's why this whole book is named Vayikra, and God called to Moshe. Now, we're going to do the first article in Fruits of the Orchard, which is on page 259 for those people who have Fruits of the Orchard. And I point out that this is not the first time that God has called to Moshe with this name, Vayikra. Where else do we see it? We see it at the burning bush, that Moshe is able to see this bush that's burning, and it's not being consumed. And the verse says, and Moshe turned to see this phenomenon of a bush burning that was not consumed. And then it says, and God called to him. So here we see that it's in response to Moshe's turning to see, to investigate. And this is what's called in Hasidut, the awakening from below, the hitorarut from below, the awakening from below. And here also, Moshe and all of Israel worked very, very hard to make this Mishkan. So it wasn't when, in this parsha, when God calls to him, it's in a vacuum. This is after a tremendous amount of effort. And Moshe is standing there, not knowing how he could even enter into, because the glory of God was filling the whole Mishkan. And that's when God calls to him in response from what Moshe and all of Am Yisrael had done. There's another time that God calls to him, and that is one of the times in the 6 days between when Israel arrived at the desert of Sinai and when we received the Torah. So in the parsha of Yitro and Mishpatim, it explains in great detail how Moshe would go up the mountain. God would call him to come up to the mountain, and he would speak to him, and then he would say, go back and tell the people. And Moshe would do this, and then the people would respond, and Moshe would go back up and tell God what the response was. And so again, in one of the instances, God calls to him, but this is after Moshe makes the effort to go back up on the mountain. So we see a pattern here that God is calling when he sees that we are trying to approach him, are trying to come close to him. And so that's when God is calling. That's the context of all these various times that God is calling to Moshe. Now, we have a general principle that we've discussed a number of times. When a word or a name is first introduced in the Torah, that becomes its, what Reb Shlomo used to call its headquarters. The first time a word or a concept or name is mentioned, it shades the meaning of every other time. So interestingly enough, the first time that the word Vayikra appears is after Adam and Chava eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, and they hear God's voice in the garden. They try to hide. And then it says, and God called to them and said, Ayeka, where are you? Which everyone understands is God knew exactly where they were. But this word, Ayeka, it means, where are you holding? What have you done? Why have you done this? And this word, Ayeka, when you pronounce it different, is Echa. That's the book of Lamentations that we read on Tisha B'Av. Echa. How could it be? That's what God is asking. But here, it's also in response. God is calling Adam and Chava after they've eaten from the tree in response from what they've done. So here is a very important principle of our relationship with God. Even though many, many, many times there's first what's called an awakening from above, and then we respond from below. But in principle, in a sense, what God is requesting from human beings is they should awaken themselves, and then God will respond in harmony to that. And so this is a very important teaching from the Baal Shem Tov. The Baal Shem Tov on the 121st Psalm, one of the songs of ascent. So it says, Hashem tzilcha al yad yaminecha. God is your shadow on your right hand. And that's usually understood to mean shadow, meaning your protector. In the context of this psalm, the 121st Psalm, it's meant that God is protected. He's at your right hand. The Baal Shem Tov had a very deep and innovative way of looking at this verse. And he said that the word tzilcha, your shadow, he says, well, let's look at what a shadow does. If a person raises their hand, then the shadow raises its hand. If a person starts jumping, then the shadow starts jumping. So the Baal Shem Tov says that God acts towards us in exact mirror image to how we act towards him and other people. This is the classic example of measure for measure, mida keneged mida. So this is, we're seeing the same thing here in Vayikra, because if we didn't know the context of the end of Shemot, that after all of the work and effort to make the Mishkan, as the verse we read, and Moshe didn't feel he could go inside. But here God is calling him and says, I'm fully aware of all of your efforts. And because of that, we can have a relationship. God creates the world in such a way, there's actually an expression in the Gemara, any place that you see the greatness of God, there you will see God's humbleness. So how do we relate to God's humbleness? God created a world in a way that he gives human beings free will to the point that a person could deny that God even exists. So you would think, like, that would be the last thing that God would want, is for someone not to recognize his existence. But that shows, in a sense, God's humbleness. And this is a hint to, in the word Vayikra, there's a small aleph. In the Torah, when you look at the word Vayikra, the aleph is small. And the usual explanation is that when God called to Moshe, Moshe was humble. And as we learned, Rashi said he was only calling to Moshe. And so Moshe, in a sense, didn't want to write in the Torah that God was specifically calling to him in his humbleness. And so God said, no, I want you to write it with an aleph, because when God approaches Bilam, for example, it says, Vayikar, he appeared to Bilam, but not in the language of he called to him. Rashi points out that Vayikra is a terminology, an expression of endearment. It's a loving expression of calling. And Rashi quotes, and we say this every day, that the angels, the kara ze el ze v'amar, kadosh, 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 that the angels call to each other every day to gather together to praise God by saying, holy, holy, holy is the God of hosts. The whole world is full of your glory. So this terminology is endearment. And so God and Moshe, as it were, came up with a compromise that the word Vayikra would have the aleph, but it would be written small. But there's another way to look at why the aleph is small, and that is God's humbleness. That when God made a place, remember, before there was creation, there was only the infinity of God. only the light of God, the eternal light of God. There was nothing else. And God makes a place for creation. Well, to do that, in a sense, as I said before, it makes such a place that a person can even deny God's existence. That shows God's humbleness, and that's the small aleph. And the small aleph also represents the dynamic through which God, as it were, made himself humble or small, and that's through the tzimtzum. God contracted his infinite being in order to make a place for the world. And so this little aleph in the word Vayikra represents that sense of humbleness. So now one more important point for this first Torah here, and that is 2 different times in the book of Bereshit, it says that Avraham called in the name of God. Avram built an altar and he called in the name of God. And so the way we can understand this is, up to now, we've been talking about God calling to Moshe, calling to all of us. But here you have a case where it's Avraham calling to God. And this is a tremendous tikkun, because according to the Arizal, Avram is a reincarnation of Adam. And the first time the word Vayikra appears, it's basically in a negative sense. God is calling to Adam and says, Ayeka, what have you done? How could you do this? Where are you holding? And so Avram is calling to God. And 2 times Avram builds an altar. It's in the same place, actually. Once is before he goes down to Egypt because of the famine, and once when he comes back. And actually, Rashi says a very important thing. It even names where this altar was. It was in a place called Ai. And in this place appears later in the book of Yoshua, when Israel fought a battle and it lost in this place called Ai. And it was like, how could this happen? Well, it turned out that one of the people had taken some of the booty. Everyone was commanded not to touch any of the booty. And this person pocketed some of the booty. And because of that, all of Israel lost this battle. So Rashi says that Avram, who was a prophet, he's actually the first person to be called a prophet in the Torah. He saw prophetically that in this place that Israel would need God's help. And so therefore he built an altar there, and 2 different times he called out in the name of God. So this had many, many different meanings why he was building this altar in this place. But for our purposes, the important thing is that he was doing this tremendous tikkun of calling to God, even before God, in a sense, uses this word calling to him. Now, of course, Avram is the first Jew. And when Avram is told about the circumcision, about the covenant of circumcision, God says to him, walk before me and be whole, be tamim. And so this idea, God says to Noah, walk with me. But with Avram, God says, walk before me. So here, Avram is calling to God even before God calls to Avram with this this language of Vayikra. So this is tremendous merit for Avraham, but it's also telling us, we could even make a formula. The more we call out to God, the more God will call to us. That's an important formula for all of us to remember in prayer, in study, in world view, that even though there are times that God calls to us before we call to him, an awakening from above, but in a sense, God wants us to call out to him. And one last thing, before Avram, there was a generation of Enosh. And there it says that in the generation of Enosh, they began to call in the name of God. But the word in the Torah that they began, the root is chet lamed, which is also the root for chol. Lavdil ben kodesh lechol, which means mundane. But it could also mean to desecrate. It could what's called desecration of God's name is called chilul Hashem, the same root, chet lamed. And so even though if you read it, especially in the English, it sounds like a really good thing. In Enosh's generation, they began to call in the name of God. But the oral tradition tells us very differently. They started to call idol worship by the name of God. They started to look at the stars and the planets and different things in nature and assign to them different powers. And they would call to them names of God, but it became idol worship. So we're told that this is one of the things that Avram was fixing when he calls to God. He builds an altar and he calls to God. Because Avram, of course, is what we call the father of monotheism. And his whole message was, it's time to get beyond idol worship and to recognize that there's really only one power in the universe, only one God. So that is our first article in Fruits of the Orchard. The second one is on page 262. And this is called The Radiant Light of Moses, the radiant light of Moshe. So here I'm going to read, and it's right after what I read to you from Shemot, meaning the end of the previous parsha, where we said that Moshe could not go into the tabernacle. And then it says like this, and then because the cloud that was manifesting the Shekhinah, the presence of God, had filled the Mishkan. And so then there's one or two sentences that describes the cloud of glory. And the last part of the description is Ki anan Hashem ala Mishkan yomam ve'esh tia laila bo le'enei kol beit Yisrael b'chol ma'asehem. So it says, and the cloud of God was on the tabernacle day and night. Oh, excuse me, in the day, and a pillar of fire was in it on the nights, and the eyes of all of Israel in all of their travelings. So it's brought down where it says a pillar of fire was in it in the nights. Well, this word in it, bo, can also mean in him. And so the sages point out that this ultimately was the source of the radiance of Moshe, is because God would speak to Moshe. And when God would speak to Moshe, the energy, the light, the wisdom of God would permeate Moshe's entire being, and it would radiate from his face. Now we see this later in the book of Bamidbar, where it says that when Moshe brought down the second tablets, it says his face was beaming with rays of light. And this is actually karnei or, beams of light. And this is the source of Michelangelo making horns on his very, very famous sculpture of Moshe, because he read it in English or Latin or Greek without the oral tradition. And one of the meanings of Karen or are horns. In an animal, a horn is a Karen. But he didn't know that it also meant beams of light. It didn't necessarily mean horns. And the description continues that when the people saw Moshe with his face radiant, they became very fearful. They couldn't look at him. He was so awesome, they could not look at him. And so the Torah explains that when God was speaking to Moshe, he would speak to him directly. And then afterwards, Moshe would put on a veil. And in contact with people, he wore this veil because the people were afraid to approach him. He was so awesome. It was so awesome. And if anyone has had the experience to be in the presence of a tzaddik, of a truly righteous person, you can relate to this idea that sometimes you could see the radiance coming from the face of a tzaddik. So there's a number of opinions. Where did the radiance come from? Now here we just discussed one of the sources, that it wasn't so much that the fire was in the Mishkan as it was in Moshe. Moshe was like a walking Sefer Torah. He was a walking messenger of God. And so therefore his face was radiant, was beaming. So there's three different other opinions brought down. One is that when God revealed the 13 midot of rachamim, the 13 principles of compassion to Moshe, so it explains, this is in the Parsha of Kitisa, excuse me, where Moshe asks, show me your glory. And God says, no one can see my face and live. A human being can only see from behind. You can't see my face and live. And so here, God is about to reveal to him the 13 midot of rachamim. And here, again, we're talking in symbolic language. God says, there is a place with me, and I will hide you in the cleft of the rock, and I will place my hand over you, and I will pass by, and I'll declare the 13 midot of Rachamim. So one of the opinions is that when God, as it were, again, we're talking very symbolic language here, when God, as it were, put his hand in front of Moshe's face, the energy of God's hand infused Moshe's entire being with a radiance. So that's one opinion where the radiance of Moshe came from. The second one is that when God handed the tablets, the first tablets to Moshe, so when you put the two tablets together, they were a cube. They were a cube. Each one was 6 by 6 by 3. But when they were put together, they were 6 by 6 by 6. It was a cube. And so the second opinion where the radiance of Moshe came from is, again, we have to understand the midrashim in an allegorical, metaphorical, symbolic way. So it says that God handed it to Moshe. So as it were, God held two of the tefachim. A tefach is a fist. So he held a measurement of 2 tefachim. Moshe from the other side held 2. And there was one more section of 2 in the middle. So because God's holding one end and Moshe the other, there's a transference of God's light. And it infused Moshe's whole being, and his face became radiant. The third opinion is that when Moshe was writing the Torah, so there was a little bit of ink left in his quill. And at one point, he just passed the quill across his face. And because the quill was the instrument through which God's will was being shown into the letters of the Torah, that the quill also had the light of God, and it also infused Moshe's face with this light. So we actually had 4 explanations, and all of them, again, we have to understand the symbolism behind these teachings. But the point is Moshe, as the one who spoke peh el peh with God, mouth to mouth. And in another place it says panim el panim, face to face. So because Moshe had such a close, intimate relationship with God, the light of God just infused his whole being till his face just radiated with light. And so we mentioned before that Moshe put a veil over his face. And the Torah calls this veil a masveh. Mem samech vav hey. Masveh. Masveh has a gematria of 111, which equals the name of the letter Aleph. Aleph Lamed Pei equals 111. So here we see something very beautiful. Give me one second. Because I want to show you the picture of the Aleph so we can see more graphically. Okay, so this is an Aleph. So one of the teachings, as it were, is God was holding, now Vav, this is a Yud, this is a Vav, and this is a Yud. according to tradition. And so Vav equals 6, which happens to have the same measurements as the tablets. And of course, the 2 tablets of the law represent the entire Torah. So here, as it were, God is grasping the tablets from one side. Moshe is grabbing them from the other side. And in the middle, these are the 2 tefachim that were connecting them together. So this is a very beautiful picture of the midrash that we're talking about. But more than that, the aleph represents, this is, as it were, God. This is human beings. So what connects God to human beings? The Torah. This is the connector between God and human beings. Now, because we learned that ultimately the Torah is meant for everyone. It's just that right now it's the Jewish people who accepted the Torah and live by the Torah. But the ultimate purpose of the Torah is that it's meant for everyone. So here we could see also, here in a sense is God calling to Moshe. This is the Mishkan. And this is Moshe standing outside, waiting to be called into the Mishkan. Further, the Aleph represents the purpose of the Mishkan. This represents an infinite light, or infinity. This represents infinity and God, what we'll call the Ein Sof. That's the term we use for infinite in Hebrew. And here is mankind and a finite universe. Well, how does infinite connect to finite? Through the Torah, and in our case here, through the Mishkan. The purpose of the Mishkan is the same purpose of the Torah, and that is to be a meeting place, a place where infinite and finite can merge. And this is also the secret of all the mitzvot. All of the mitzvot are, I'll just show again, just so it's clear. In a certain way, this is the mitzvah. The mitzvah is a conduit for infinite light wisdom. And this is us fulfilling the mitzvah. So by doing the mitzvah, it draws the infinite into the mitzvah and into the one who is doing it. So this is all represented by the Aleph, and this is the name of the veil that Moshe puts around his face. Now, one last thing is that Aleph as a word has a number of meanings. One of them is Elef, 1,000. Well, here we have a great paradox of the Aleph. Aleph in Gematria equals 1, but the name of the letter, Aleph, means 1,000. In the Torah, the largest number that's used is 1,000. And let's say when it's describing the 600,000, so it's 60 myriads of 10,000. In the Torah, there is no millions or billions or trillions or zillions. There's 1,000. And if there are a lot of thousands, then it's just a multiple of 1,000. So 1,000 represents multiplicity. Aleph represents the number 1. So this becomes the the context of the paradox of we live in a world of multiplicity, and yet behind the veil, the masveh of the multiplicity is the oneness of God. Just like the oneness of God was infusing Moshe's whole being, so too God infuses all of reality. Okay, we have one more, but I remember that Jody says she can only stay until the hour is up. So I just want to again say that we're dedicating this class to Michael Yitzhak ben Yaakov Yosef. Should have an aliyah to neshama, and he should be a melitz yosher for all of us. Okay, so we're going to continue with one more Torah, and that's the next one on page 265 in Fruits of the Orchard. And we'll do this fairly quickly. And this is called Not by Bread Alone, in the Parsha of Vayikra. Now, we haven't even really talked about the whole Parsha. How could we in just an hour? But here begins the explanation of the different offerings that were brought in the Mishkan and, of course, later in the temple. And these offerings become the basis of the prayers that we say today. And so part of the explanations is that on different offerings, salt was always brought. And it even calls salt an everlasting covenant. So let's just look at what's the significance of putting salt on all of the offerings. So just first of all, we'll point out that the word in Hebrew for salt is melach, mem lamed chet. It's the same letters, but in a different permutation than lechem, bread. And this is connected to the universal custom that when we eat bread, we dip it in salt before we even taste it. And in fact, we'll see in a second, we dip it 3 times, and we'll learn why that is. So here we see an amazing connection. And we have this custom of dipping our bread in salt, but the letters that make up bread and salt are the exact same letters. Now, different commentaries add to this. The same root of these same 3 letters is the root of the word to dream, chalom. Here it's the order of chet, lamed, mem, chalom. And there's even a 4th, and that is to fight, to battle. In modern Hebrew, a soldier, a fighter, is called a lochem. And the order here is lamed, chet, mem. So they're all in different orders, but they're the same 3-letter root. So I'm not sure who is the source for this, but it's a well-known idiom that based on these 4 words or concepts all having the same letters. So the idiom is some people fight for bread, others fight for their dreams. It's a very, very beautiful idea. And I just want to add this, and some of you who are listening will understand. A very good friend of ours, whose name also is Michael Golem, he also passed from this world, I believe his yurtzeit was just, I think it's 13 years. Doesn't seem that long ago, though. I might be wrong. Anyways, he was the gabbai in the moshav for many years, and he used to give brachas. He gave these, when someone had an aliyah to the Torah, and he would give these very deep spiritual brachas to everyone instead of the standard bracha. And he used to say so many times to people, he would say, never, ever, ever, ever give up your dreams. And he used to say it with such passion. So, Jody, I'm remembering another Michael in Michael's name. Okay, now let's go. Why do we dip the bread in salt 3 times? So the gematria of salt is 78. The gematria of bread is 78. Well, 78 is 3 times 26. 26 is the gematria of the 4-letter name of God. So first of all, it's God who established this idea of putting salt on the offerings. And we're told today, and this is a very, very cardinal, fundamental concept, that we don't have a temple now. We don't have an altar. And as I mentioned before, everything that was done in the temple has been translated into our prayers, into our synagogues, into our homes. So we're told today, well, what happened to the altar? Where is the altar? The altar is the table that we eat by. And we're told that when we eat in a spiritual way, then the eating becomes, in a sense, an offering to God. And we do that by saying blessings before we eat. We say blessings after we eat. When we eat bread, we do something special. We wash our hands. We say another blessing. And we eat with the idea that eating is not just an animalistic desire or passion or need. Of course, we need food. We can't exist without food and drink. But we have the ability to turn physical reality and infuse it with spiritual content. So by dipping the bread 3 times in the salt, we're, in a sense, conjuring up the energy of God, and we're turning our eating into a spiritual practice. Our table becomes an altar, and through our blessings and our kavanot, we are offering our love and thanks to God for providing for us for the food. So this is a very, very, very important idea. And we'll end with this, that in the book of Devarim, if anyone wants to look it up, the 8th chapter, the 3rd verse. So it says, and I'm starting from the middle of the verse, so that he would make you know that man does not live by bread alone, but rather by whatever comes forth from the mouth of God does man live. And this actually, even in the Western world, has become a very well-known saying, that we don't live by bread alone. But here it says that we live from everything that comes from the mouth of God. So that, again, that's why dipping 3 times and being aware that this is 3 times God's name is conjuring up this idea that we're thanking God for the bread and the food, but we're also aware that it's God who is providing it. And the life force in the food is coming from God. And therefore, we're not living by bread alone, but everything that comes from the mouth of God, because we learn that God creates through speech. And so existence is a constant flow of the, as it were, the speech of God maintaining all of creation. So we'll end with a blessing. Simply that we could remember that. We could remember that everything ultimately comes from the mouth of God. The mouth of God is giving us the Torah. And it's the Torah that's infusing us with life and light like Moshe. And to go back to what we learned in the beginning, to encourage all of us to call out to God in prayer, communal prayer, individual prayer, hitbodedut, in very individual type of prayer, whatever comes from the heart. And the formula, we shall all be blessed that the more we call out to God, the more God will call out to us.